I never really thought much about night shifts. I guess that's why I was hired to work them. As a nursing assistant at St. Michael's Hospital, I wasn't new to late hours. In fact, I liked the quiet the hospital would settle into a hum, with fewer people walking around. It was peaceful, almost calming. But that all changed the night I started working at the isolated section of the hospital known as the Long Ward. The Long Ward had been around for as long as anyone could remember. It was an older part of the hospital, a section used mostly for patients who were in critical care and those who didn't have much longer to live. I had never worked there before, but when I was assigned to cover the night shift in that part of the hospital, I thought it would just be like every other shift. A few quiet hours, maybe some paperwork, and the usual dull routine. What I didn't know was that I was about to become part of a story I'll never be able to forget. It was a Tuesday night, sometime around 10 p.m. when I first stepped into the Long Ward. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, casting harsh shadows against the walls, and the silence felt oppressive, like it was wrapping around me. I glanced at the nurses' station. Just one other nurse was there, a middle-aged woman named Carol, who had been working at the hospital longer than I had been alive. She gave me a tired nod as she handed me a clipboard filled with patient charts. "Same as always," she said, her voice low. "They won't bother you. Just check in on them every hour." I glanced at the charts, trying to absorb the details. There were 5 patients listed, all in critical condition. It wasn't unusual for patients to stay for extended periods in the Long Ward, but something about the way Carol spoke made me uneasy. "Just check in on them every hour," she repeated, her eyes looking down as though she was avoiding mine. I nodded, brushing off the chill that crept up my something. Spine. I made my rounds, checking on each patient in their rooms. Most of them were in beds, hooked up to machines that beeped every now and then. Some were unconscious, others had their eyes half closed, barely moving. I entered room 101 first. The patient there was an elderly man, Mr. Peters. His skin was pale, his breathing slow and labored. The heart monitor was a steady beep, so I assumed he was alive, just struggling. I adjusted his blanket and marked his chart before moving to the next room. As I moved through the Long Ward, I felt the coldness of the rooms pressing in on me. Each patient was the same, pale, barely breathing, hooked to machines that made soft beeping sounds in the distance. I checked their vitals, adjusted their pillows, and took notes, but there was something unsettling about them. They were all so still. When I reached room 104, I stopped short. There was a woman lying in the bed, her hair matted to her forehead. She looked different. Her body was unnaturally still, no rise and fall of her chest. I leaned closer, but she looked like she was just sleeping. Her skin was cold to the touch, but her face was soft, serene. I checked the monitor. It was flat. Confused, I stepped back. "How is that possible?" I whispered to myself. I quickly checked the chart. The patient, Mrs. Landon, had been declared brain dead, but I could have sworn she looked alive. I shook my head and tried to shrug it off. It was late after all. I was probably just tired. The rest of the night passed slowly, but uneventfully. I kept an eye on the monitors, checked the charts, and tried to convince myself that I was overthinking things, but something gnawed at the back of my mind. The more I thought about Mrs. Landon's room, the more it bothered me. By the time I reached my 4th hour of the shift, my exhaustion was starting to set in. As I passed by room 103, I heard a faint whispering. I froze, listening. The whisper was soft but unmistakable. I approached the door carefully and pressed my ear against it. It wasn't a conversation. It was a low murmur, almost as if someone was trying to speak but couldn't form words. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up. I pushed the door open slightly. The room was dark, but I could make out the figure of Mr. Harris, the patient lying there. His eyes were wide open, staring straight ahead. His lips trembled, but no sound came out. I rushed over to check his vitals. His heart rate was normal, but I noticed something strange. His fingers twitched. He was paralyzed, but his hand kept moving, like he was trying to reach out for something or someone. I took a step back, feeling a wave of dread wash over me. I had never seen anything like this before. I ran from room to room, but each patient's condition was worse than the last. Mrs. Landon's body had gone completely cold, yet her face still held that peaceful expression. Mr. Harris was no longer twitching. His body was perfectly still, but his eyes followed me as I moved around the room. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't think straight. What was happening to them? Why weren't they dead, but why did they look dead? I rushed back to the nurse's station, but Carol was gone. The lights flickered above me. The air seemed thicker, heavier. That's when I heard it, a voice, a low whisper, coming from the end of the hall. The voice was familiar. It was Carol. "Help us." I turned and ran down the hallway, my heart pounding louder with each step. The whisper echoed louder, closer. I reached the end of the hall, to the door of the break room. But when I pushed it open, I was met with an unbearable sight. Carol was standing there, her back to me, her head twisted at an unnatural angle, her arms bent backward as if they didn't belong to her body. And there, in the shadows of the room, were the other patients, their eyes vacant, their bodies lifeless. They weren't alive. They weren't. Dead. They were trapped. And now, so was I. I don't know how I managed to escape that night. The authorities never found the bodies, or if they did, they never told anyone. They closed off the long ward and transferred the patients to other parts of the hospital. But the truth is, I'll never be able to forget what I saw that night. The twisted bodies, the hollow eyes. They weren't ghosts. They were something worse. Something that shouldn't exist in this world. The worst part? I still hear that voice, whispering in the dead of night, "Help us." The new neighbor smiles every night at 3 a.m., but she's been dead for 12 years. Creepypasta, it started as something small, a harmless curiosity that I shrugged off at first, thinking I was just imagining things. The kind of thing you don't bother telling anyone because, well, who would believe it? It wasn't until I started seeing her every night that I knew something was wrong. It was the smile. That damn smile. I just moved into a small 2-story house in a quiet neighborhood. The kind of place where nothing ever really happens. The house was old, charming in its own way, with a squeaky wooden floor that I quickly learned to navigate at night. I wasn't new to living on my own, but this house felt different. The atmosphere was thick, as if the walls had absorbed something over the years. It wasn't oppressive, but it was noticeable, and I noticed it from the moment I stepped inside. The first week was uneventful. I unpacked, arranged my things, and explored the house. The neighbors were friendly, especially one woman who lived next door. She was older, with a kind face, and she welcomed me with a plate of cookies and a smile that seemed just a little too wide. I didn't think much of it at the time, chalking it up to her being one of those overly nice neighbors. But that smile, it stuck with me. It was around 3 a.m. when I woke up to the sound of soft tapping on my window. Groggy and annoyed, I sat up in bed, unsure whether I was dreaming or actually hearing something. I got out of bed and walked over to the window, slowly pulling back the blinds. At first, I saw nothing, just the empty street, the faint glow of the street light casting long shadows over the pavement. But then, I saw her. Standing at the end of my driveway, looking directly at my window, was the neighbor woman. Her face was barely visible in the dim light, but her smile, that wide, unsettling smile, was unmistakable. It stretched unnaturally across her face, like she was trying to show every single tooth. I couldn't look away. I froze, my heart pounding in my chest. She was standing there, completely still, like a mannequin. Her eyes were empty, void of any emotion. But the smile was terrifying. I didn't know what to do. My mind screamed at me to call the police, but my legs wouldn't move. I couldn't even make a sound. And then, as if sensing my fear, she began to slowly raise her hand and wave. The tapping continued on the window, but it was more like a rhythm now, as if she was waiting for something. For me. I don't remember when I finally closed the blinds, but I did, and I retreated into my bed, my heart still racing. I tried to convince myself it was just a trick of the light, or some weird dream, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong. The next night, I stayed up late, watching TV in an attempt to distract myself. But as the clock struck 3 a.m. again, I felt that familiar chill in the air. The house, which had seemed warm and inviting earlier in the day, now felt cold and distant. I told myself it was just the wind. Maybe it was just the house settling. But then the tapping came again. Soft, steady, familiar. I didn't want to look, but I couldn't help myself. I crept to the window and pulled back the blinds, and there she was. The same woman, standing at the end of my driveway, her head tilted slightly to one side, that grotesque smile stretched across her face. This time, I didn't freeze. I felt the panic rise in my chest like a tide. I backed away from the window, my breathing shallow, my palms sweaty. The tapping turned into knocking, louder now, more urgent. I backed into the corner of my room, my eyes glued to the window, watching her, waiting for her to move. But she didn't. She stood there, as still as a statue, staring at me. And then, just like before, she raised her hand and waved. I bolted out of the room and locked the door behind me. I didn't know what I was supposed to do, but I knew I couldn't face her again. I spent the rest of the night awake on the couch, trembling, staring at the clock, waiting for 3 a.m. to pass. The next morning, I decided to get to the bottom of this. I wasn't going to let fear control me. There had to be an explanation, right? Maybe the woman was just a bit eccentric. Maybe she had a good reason for being out there every night. I went next door to visit her, hoping to have a normal conversation, but when I knocked on her door, I was met with silence. I knocked again. Still nothing. I checked the mailbox. Her name was there, but it didn't explain why she hadn't responded. I decided to ask a neighbor down the street. I caught a man who was out walking his dog and asked if he knew anything about the woman next door. His expression faltered, and he glanced at the ground before looking up at me. "You don't know, do you?" I frowned, confused. "Know what? She's been dead for 12 years. She died in a car accident right outside this neighborhood. The whole street was in shock. She was a kind woman, but, well, after the accident, people started saying they'd seen her standing outside their windows at night, just like you said. People thought it was some kind of trick of the light, but others, they were sure it was her." I felt my blood run cold. I was frozen for a moment, my mind racing. "So, you're telling me she's been dead for 12 years, and yet I'm seeing her every night?" The man nodded gravely. "Some people say she never left, that she's still stuck in this place, waiting for something, waiting for someone." That night, I could barely breathe. My head was spinning with the new information. I had to see her again. I had to confront this, whatever it was, and end it once and for all. As the clock neared 3 a.m., my heart began to pound in my chest. The house felt colder than ever, the air heavy with anticipation. And then, as if on cue, the tapping began. I got up, walked to the window, and looked outside. There she was. But this time, she was closer. Much closer. She was standing in the yard, only a few feet from my window, her head now turned completely to the side, her smile stretching impossibly wide. Her eyes were black, like hollow pits. And in the stillness of the night, I could hear her whispering. It wasn't words, just a low, eerie hum, like a chant. I could feel my legs shaking. This wasn't just a ghost. It wasn't just some trick. This was something far worse. She took a slow step forward, and I felt the breath leave my lungs. I couldn't look away. "Help me," she whispered. In a blind panic, I ran out of the room and down the stairs, slamming the door shut behind me. I stumbled to the basement door, locking myself inside. I didn't know what was happening, but I knew I couldn't stay there any longer. The next morning, I packed my things and left the house. I didn't care what I left behind. I couldn't stay there another night, not with her waiting for me. But even now, years later, I still hear the tapping. I hear it every night at 3 a.m., and I know she's still out there. I worked the night shift at a hospital until I realized the patients weren't alive. Scary true story. I'd always thought working the night shift at a hospital would be just like any other job. The quiet hours, the slow rhythm of checking in on patients, and the occasional interruption of emergency calls. I never expected to encounter anything strange, let alone something that would change my life forever. I've worked in hospitals for years, but that night, in that particular ward, I learned that not everything in the hospital is what it seems. This is my story, and I'm telling it because I want people to know that some things, some places, are not meant to be questioned. Sometimes you should just walk away, no matter how hard it is to believe what's happening in front of you. It was a Friday night, late enough that the hospital had settled into a familiar quiet. The usual bustle of daytime activity had died down, and now only the occasional nurse or doctor walked the sterile hallways. I had been assigned to the night shift in the intensive care unit ICU that week. The ICU was always quieter at night, and I liked the calmness of it. I didn't mind the solitude. It gave me time to focus on my tasks without the distractions of the day shift. The nurse on duty, Carol, greeted me as I arrived at the nurse's station. She was an older woman, probably in her late 50s, with graying hair and a tired smile. She had been working at Street. Thomas Hospital for years, and it showed. Carol was the kind of person who'd seen it all. She'd probably seen enough horror stories in the hospital to last a lifetime, and she didn't seem bothered by much. "Everything's pretty calm tonight," Carol said, handing me a clipboard with a list of patients. "Just check in on the regulars and make sure the monitors are still good. Room 302 is a bit touch and go though, so don't leave her alone too long." I nodded, absorbing the details, but the mention of Room 302 caught my attention. I'd heard rumors about that room, about the patient who'd been there for weeks. The whispers among the staff were that she wasn't doing well, and no one really knew why she hadn't passed on yet. "Who's in 302? I asked, trying to sound casual. "That's Mrs. Linden," Carol replied. "She's been here a while. Brain activity is minimal. You might want to keep an eye on her." I took the list of patients, nodded again, and started my rounds. The first few rooms were uneventful. There were the usual monitors, the slow hum of machines, and the faint scent of antiseptic in the air. But as I reached the end of the hallway and turned toward room 302, I could feel something shift. It wasn't the air, no. That was the same sterile, cold atmosphere of the hospital. It was something else, something deeper. The door to room 302 was slightly ajar. I could see the faint glow of a heart monitor flickering inside. I pushed the door open slowly, not wanting to disturb the quiet. Mrs. Linden was lying in bed, surrounded by tubes and monitors. Her face was pale, almost ghostly, and her chest barely moved with each shallow breath. She looked like a woman who had been hanging on to life for far too long. I walked over to her bed and checked the monitor. The numbers seemed fine. Her vitals were steady, but there was something unsettling about the stillness of her body. The room was too quiet, too calm. I checked her IV, adjusted her blankets, and jotted down a few notes. As I was about to leave, I noticed something odd. Her eyes, she had been unconscious the whole time, but her eyes were slightly open, just a fraction. Her pupils were fixed, unblinking, staring straight ahead at nothing in particular. I leaned in closer, trying to get a better look. That's when I saw it. Her mouth twitched, just barely, but enough that I could see it. It wasn't the usual involuntary twitch that comes with medical conditions. This was deliberate, slow, as if she was trying to communicate. I pulled back, my heart racing a little faster. I reached for the call button and asked the charge nurse, "Is there any movement on Mrs. Linden's part?" She confirmed the same minimal brain activity, but nothing like this. It made no sense. I shrugged it off. Maybe I was just imagining things. But as I moved toward the door, I heard it a soft, raspy breath, too soft to be from any living person, coming from Mrs. Linden's direction. I froze. The rest of the night passed uneventfully, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off with room 302. Every time I passed by the room, I looked in and saw Mrs. Linden lying perfectly still, but each time I returned, her eyes seemed a little more open, her mouth twitching just slightly more. I checked her vital signs again, but everything was normal, too normal. The clock on the wall struck 3 a.m., and that's when it started. I heard a sound. It was a low murmur, coming from the hallway outside. At first, I thought it was the usual hospital noise, the click of a door, the shuffle of feet. But then I heard it more clearly. A whisper. So faint, I wasn't sure if I was imagining it. I turned toward room 302, the sound seeming to emanate from there. I walked toward the door, my feet echoing in the empty corridor. As I pushed it open, I saw Mrs. Linden again, lying perfectly still. But this time, her lips weren't just twitching, she was smiling. Not a wide, joyful smile, but something far darker. The edges of her lips stretched unnaturally, as though they were too tight for her face. The smile was cold, lifeless. My heart pounded in my chest as I backed away. I tried to call for Carol, but when I turned around to leave the room, the hallway was completely silent. No footsteps, no distant voices, just the unnerving quiet of the night. I stared at the door, unsure of what I was seeing. Then, the whisper came again, louder this time. "Help." No, the whispers grew louder over the next few hours. They weren't just coming from Mrs. Linden anymore. As I moved between the rooms, I began hearing them from the other patients, patients who were supposed to be in deep comas, their chances of recovery slim to none. And yet, their lips were twitching, their eyes slightly open, and their mouths were forming the same phrase, "Help me." I didn't know what to think anymore. I ran to Carol, but when I tried to tell her, she just gave me a weary look and said, "It's nothing, honey. You're just tired. It happens to everyone." But I wasn't tired. I was terrified. That night, I couldn't sleep. I stayed awake, watching the monitors and listening to the whispers. At 3 a.m., I saw it again. This time it wasn't just Mrs. Linden. All the patients in the ICU had their eyes slightly open, and they were all whispering. Their faces were locked in frozen smiles, their bodies too still. The whispers came from every room, from every bed, and they weren't speaking to each other. They were speaking to me. "Help us! Help us!" By the time my shift ended, I was a wreck. My mind couldn't process what had happened, what I had witnessed. I wasn't sure what was real anymore, and what was just my imagination breaking under the strain. But the worst part? Carol wasn't surprised. She didn't even seem concerned. She told me that it happens sometimes that the souls of patients who couldn't pass on, for one reason or another, linger in the ward. They're trapped, suspended between life and death. But that wasn't the worst part. As I walked out of the hospital that morning, I overheard two nurses talking in the hallway. They were talking about Mrs. Linden, but what they said made my blood run cold. She died 6 months ago. We've been keeping her body on life support ever since. The family asked us to, for closure, but it's getting worse. The realization hit me like a freight train. The patients in that ward weren't alive. They were dead. They were just waiting for something that I didn't understand. And every night, I could still hear the whispers. "Help us. I don't work at Street Thomas anymore." I couldn't. The memories still haunt me, and sometimes, when I'm alone at night, I can still hear their whispers. The things I saw in that ward, the unnatural smiles, the cold bodies, they stay with me. If you ever find yourself in a hospital at 3 a.m. and you hear whispers from the rooms, don't go looking. Just walk away, because sometimes the dead don't rest. I'm a 911 operator. The call I took from the silent woods still haunts me. The first rule of the graveyard shift is that coffee is not a luxury, it's a survival tool. The second rule is that the weird calls always come after 2 a.m. I'd been a 911 operator for 6 years in our moderately sized county, and I thought I'd heard it all. The frantic, the tragic, the horrifyingly mundane, and the outright bizarre. I was wrong. Our dispatch center is a sterile, blue-lit room that hums with the low thrum of computer servers and the quiet, controlled voices of my colleagues. It's a bubble of order against the chaos of the outside world. That night started like any other. A few domestic disputes, a fender bender on the interstate, a noise complaint about a barking dog, the usual symphony of a small town settling into uneasy sleep. At 2:47 a.m., a call lit up my screen. Line 4. The location data was a mess. The GPS was pinging a single, flickering dot in the middle of a massive, unserviced area to the north of the county, an area we all knew. The Blackwood National Forest is what it's called on the maps. But locals, we call it the Silent Woods. It's one of those places that has a reputation, not for ghost stories or lovers' lane murders, but for something more primal. Hunters say their compasses spin there. Animals, they say, don't make a sound once you pass the tree line. The birds go quiet. The insects stop buzzing. It's just silent. People get lost in there with an unnerving frequency, and when they're found, if they're found, they're never quite right again. We had a standing unofficial advisory: dispatch units to the edge, but never ever send them in on foot after dark. The flickering dot on my map was deep inside. I took a sip of my lukewarm coffee. The bitter taste, a familiar comfort. I clicked to answer. 911. What is your emergency? The line was filled with a soft, hissing static, like an old radio between stations. For a moment, I thought it was a dead call. Then, a voice came through, small and clear. Hello? It was a child, a little boy, maybe 7 or 8 years old. His voice was unnaturally calm. No crying, no panic. This is 911, I said, my tone automatically shifting to be gentle, reassuring. Can you tell me your name, buddy? Leo, he said. I'm lost. Okay, Leo, it's okay. We're going to find you. Can you tell me what you see around you? Are there any grown-ups with you? There was a pause. The static on the line seemed to deepen, to swallow the silence. No, I'm alone, he said. Then, after another beat, he added, well, not anymore. A cold prickle went down my spine. I ignored it. Okay, Leo, what do you see? Are you in the woods? Yes, he replied, his voice still that same eerie monotone. "The trees don't have leaves. They're just arms. They're all reaching for the moon, but the moon is wrong." "Wrong? What do you mean the moon is wrong, Leo?" I was typing furiously, logging the call, trying to get a stable lock on his GPS. It kept jumping. "It's broken," he said simply. "It's all cracked, like a plate." I glanced at the window. The moon outside was a perfect, brilliant white half circle. My supervisor, Dave, a burly man with a permanent look of exhaustion, walked by and raised an eyebrow at the frantic look on my face. I pointed to the map on my screen. His eyes widened when he saw the location. "Leo, is there anyone with you now? You said you're not alone anymore." "He's here," the boy whispered. The static crackled. "He's very tall." My blood ran cold. "Leo, who is with you? Is it a man? Tell him to talk to me. He doesn't have a mouth," Leo said. "He wants me to tell you. He wants me to tell you to stop looking." My fingers froze over the keyboard. Every hair on my arms was standing on end. This wasn't a lost kid. This was something else. Dave was now leaning over my console, his own headset plugged in, listening. His face was a mask of grim concern. "I'm sending a bleeze. Car to the edge of Blackwood, Route 7, he murmured, his voice low. "That's the closest access point." I nodded, trying to keep my voice steady for the boy. "Leo, we're sending help, okay? Just keep talking to me." "What is the tall man doing?" "He's smiling," Leo said, and for the first time, there was a tremor in his voice, a hint of fear. "But he doesn't have a mouth. It's just a fold in his face. He wants me to tell you your coffee is cold, Jack." I dropped my pen. It clattered on the floor. No one had said my name. Not on the call, not in the room. My name tag was clipped to my belt, invisible from Dave's position. My blood turned to ice water. How do you know my name, Leo?" The voice that came back was not Leo's. It was a layered, distorted sound, a chorus of whispers twisted into the shape of a child's voice. "We know all the names." I physically recoiled from my screen. Dave gripped my shoulder, his knuckles white. "What the hell was that?" he breathed. "Unit 14, this is dispatch," Dave said into his mic. His professional calm, a thin veneer over raw alarm. "Approaching the access point on Route 7. What's your 20? Officer Miller's voice crackled back, calm and professional. "Dispatch, I'm at the trailhead. It's quiet out here, real quiet. We have an active call, possible missing child deep in the woods," Dave said, omitting the more bizarre details. "Can you see anything from your position?" While they spoke, the voice on my line returned. It was Leo again, but he was crying now. Soft, terrified sobs. "He's making the trees dance," he whimpered. "I don't like it. They're making a sound now." "A sound? Leo, what sound?" Like bones breaking." Over and over. He was starting to hyperventilate. "He knows your friend is here, the one in the car with the lights." My heart hammered against my ribs. "Miller," I whispered to Dave. "It knows Miller is there." Dave grabbed his mic. "Unit 14, fall back. I repeat, fall back to a safe distance. Do not enter the woods." "Copy that, dispatch," Miller replied, but there was a new edge to his voice. "Just hold on. I think I hear something. Sounds like a kid." "Miller, that's a negative. Do not engage," Dave commanded. On my line, Leo's crying stopped abruptly. The static surged, louder now, angrier. Then, a new voice came through the phone. A perfect digital replica of Dave's. "It's okay, Jack," it said, smooth and commanding. "Everything is under control. You can hang up now." I felt my stomach lurch. It was using my supervisor's voice. I looked at Dave, who was staring at me, his face pale, his mouth hanging open. He shook his head slowly. "Who is this?" I demanded into the headset, my voice shaking. The voice chuckled, a sound like dry leaves skittering across pavement. Then it changed again. This time it was a voice I knew better than my own. A voice that whispered my name every night before I went to sleep. My wife, Sarah. "Jack, honey," the voice cooed. "What are you doing? Come home. I left the porch light on for you." It was perfect. Her exact intonation, the soft lilt in her voice. It was so perfect that for a split second I believed it. A wave of exhaustion washed over me. A sudden, desperate urge to just hang up, go home, and crawl into bed next to my wife. "No," I choked out. tears welling in my eyes. "No, you're not her." The sweet voice turned venomous. "I can be," it hissed, the sound now a discordant harmony of a dozen different voices, men, women, children, all speaking at once. "We can be anyone. Unit 14, respond." Dave was shouting into his mic now. Miller's line had gone to static. The chorus on my line spoke again, its voice a triumphant, terrible crescendo. "He's coming to see the boy with the broken moon in his eyes. He is ours now." Then I heard it, through my headset, coming from deep within the silent woods. It was a scream. Officer Miller's scream. It was high and raw and full of agony, and it was cut short by a wet, crunching snap. The line went dead. Silence. The only sound in the dispatch center was my own ragged breathing. Dave was still trying to raise Miller, his voice cracking. "Unit 14, do you copy?" "Miller, respond." "God damn it." For a full minute, there was nothing but static from Miller's radio. Then it cleared. A single sound came through every speaker in the dispatch center. It wasn't Miller's voice. It was the voice of the little boy, Leo, but it was old and ragged, ancient, and filled with a terrible, patient malice. "The trees don't have leaves," it whispered. And then, only static remained. They mounted a search party at dawn. They found Officer Miller's patrol car parked at the trailhead, engine cold, doors locked. They found his flashlight a few yards into the woods, its beam dead. They found one of his boots, caught on a root. They never found him. Leo was never identified. There were no missing children reports filed in our county or any of the surrounding ones that week. It was as if he never existed. The official report says Officer Miller got lost in the dense, treacherous terrain during an unsanctioned search. I quit my job a week later. I couldn't sit in that chair anymore. Couldn't listen to the static between calls without hearing whispers. The call haunts me, but not in the way you might think. It's not just the memory. It's the feeling, the certainty that the thing in the woods, the thing that wears voices like a coat, it didn't just take Miller. It reached out through that phone line and it touched me. Sometimes, late at night, when the house is quiet and my wife is breathing softly beside me, I'll hear a faint sound from the baby monitor in my daughter's room, a soft, hissing static. And through it, I can sometimes hear a whisper. A small, calm voice telling her stories. Stories about a tall man with no mouth and a sky with a broken moon. I took a night job at a toy factory. The "don't look at the dolls after midnight" rule was real. Financial desperation makes you do stupid things. For me, that meant taking a night security job at a place that had been bleeding money for 30 years. The Auerbach & Sons toy factory. The pay was just enough to cover my tuition and rent, provided I subsisted on a diet of instant noodles and crippling anxiety. The factory was a relic, a sprawling brick carcass on the forgotten edge of town. During the day, a skeleton crew of weary-looking women would run the ancient groaning machinery, churning out cheap plastic toys for dollar stores. But at night, the place was mine alone. My job was simple: walk the perimeter, punch a time clock at 4 different stations, and make sure no one broke in to steal injection molds that were probably worth less than the gas it would take to haul them away. The guy I replaced was a wiry old man named Sal, who looked like he'd been running on caffeine and nicotine since the Nixon administration. He walked me through the rounds on my first night, his keys jangling like a nervous ghost. "It's an easy gig," he rasped, smoke curling from his lips. "Walk your rounds on the hour, every hour, don't sleep, and a couple of quirks with the old place." I nodded, trying to look competent. "Quirks?" "Yeah." He pointed a shaky finger at a massive, silent piece of equipment on the main assembly floor. "The main press, the one that stamps out the doll bodies. Sometimes it kicks on by itself. Old wiring. Freaked me out the first time. If it happens, just hit the big red emergency stop. It'll shut right up." "Okay," I said. "Easy enough." "And one more thing," he said, his voice dropping. He glanced over his shoulder at the far end of the warehouse, towards a dimly lit section cordoned off by a velvet rope. Inside were glass display cases, holding antique-looking porcelain dolls. The Auerbach Heritage Collection, according to a faded brass plaque. "After midnight," Sal said, his eyes fixed on the display. "Just do your rounds, but don't look at them. The porcelain ones." I laughed a little. "What, they'll getcha?" Sal didn't laugh back. He took a long drag from his cigarette, the orange tip glowing in the gloom. "Look, kid." This building is old. It plays tricks on your eyes when you're tired. You stare at those glass eyes long enough, you'll start seeing things. Just save yourself the spook. Don't look at the dolls after midnight. That's it." He handed me the keys, clapped me on the shoulder, and was gone before I could ask another question. The first week was fine. Boring, mostly. The silence was the worst part. The sheer oppressive weight of it. Every creak of the building, every groan of settling metal was amplified into a gunshot in the dead of night. I followed the rules. I walked my rounds. I drank terrible coffee from a thermos. And after midnight, I consciously averted my eyes whenever I passed the Heritage Collection. I felt stupid doing it, but Sal's warning had planted a tiny, irrational seed of fear in my mind. It was on my 8th shift that the first quirk happened. Around 1:30 a.m., a deafening K-chunk war echoed through the factory. I nearly jumped out of my skin. It was the main press, just like Sal had said. A massive steel arm rose and fell with methodical, violent force, stamping out non-existent doll torsos from a sheet of empty air. My heart hammered against my ribs, but I remembered his words. I walked over, my footsteps sounding unnaturally loud, and slammed my palm on the big red button. The machine groaned to a halt. The silence that followed was somehow worse than the noise. That's when the real unease set in. Sal was right about the press. What if he was right about the dolls, too? The following night, I found myself becoming hyper-aware of the Heritage Collection. I feel it as I walked by. A weight in the air. The feeling of being watched by dozens of tiny, unblinking eyes. I'd catch flickers of movement in my periphery, a white dress, a glint of light off a porcelain cheek, but whenever I'd snap my head around, everything was still, perfectly, unnaturally still. My mind was playing tricks on me, just like Sal said. It had to be. By the second week, I was a wreck. Sleep deprivation and a diet of cheap energy drinks were fraying my nerves. The whispers started then, faint, like the rustle of silk, always just on the edge of my hearing. I'd be at one end of the factory and swear I heard a child's giggle from the other. I was losing it. I knew I was, and I became obsessed with the rule. It felt like a dare, like a splinter in my mind that I had to pull out. I convinced myself that the only way to get over this stupid, childish fear was to face it, to prove that they were just dolls in a glass case. It was a Tuesday, 2:17 a.m. The air was cold and heavy. I stood before the velvet rope, my heart thudding a nervous rhythm. I took a deep breath, stepped over the rope, and walked toward the Heritage Collection. There were about 30 of them, each in its own little display. They wore old-fashioned lace dresses, sailor suits, and tiny leather shoes. Their painted-on smiles were unnerving, their glass eyes holding a vacant, yet somehow knowing, stare. My flashlight beam glided over them. Little Clarice, button-eyed Ben, rosy-cheeked Rebecca. I settled on one in the center. She was called Sweet Annabelle. She had blonde curly hair and a pale blue dress. Her eyes were a piercing crystalline blue. I stared right into them, my breath held tight in my chest. Nothing. Absolutely nothing. She was a doll. A creepy, expensive doll, but a doll nonetheless. A wave of relief washed over me, so potent it made me dizzy. I felt like an idiot. I let out a shaky laugh, the sound echoing in the cavernous space. "See? Just a doll," I whispered to myself. I turned my back on the display and continued my round, feeling lighter than I had in days. I walked the length of the factory floor, punched the time clock at Station C, and turned back. That's when I saw it. The glass case that had held Sweet Annabelle was empty. My blood turned to ice. It wasn't possible. I was the only one here. The doors were locked. I spun around, my flashlight beam cutting a frantic arc through the darkness. "Hello?" I called out, my voice a pathetic squeak. "Is anyone there?" Silence. I took a hesitant step back towards the display cases. My light scanned the other dolls. They were all there, their painted smiles seeming to mock me. But Annabelle's case was undeniably, terrifyingly empty. Thump. The sound came from behind a stack of empty plastic crates about 50 feet away. It was a soft sound, like a small object being dropped. "Who's there?" I shouted, trying to sound braver than I felt. A giggle answered me. It wasn't in the air. It was coming from the factory's PA system, a tinny, distorted sound that scraped at my sanity, a little girl's giggle layered with the hiss of static. My training, my job, my sanity, it all evaporated. I ran, not towards the exit, but towards the only place that felt safe, the small, windowless security office with its solid steel door. As I sprinted across the concrete floor, I saw them. Out of the corners of my eyes, in the deep shadows between the hulking machines, there was movement. Small, quick, human-shaped figures darting from one pool of darkness to the next. I didn't dare look directly at them. I just ran. The sound of tiny, hard-soled shoes tapping on concrete began to echo behind me. It wasn't one set of footsteps. It was dozens. Click, clack, click, clack, click, clack. They were chasing me. The security office was just ahead. I fumbled for my keys, my hands shaking so badly I could barely fit the key into the lock. The clicking was getting louder, closer. A high-pitched, childish whisper slithered through the air right behind me. "You looked." I felt a cold, impossibly strong grip on my ankle. I cried out and kicked backward, my boot connecting with something hard and brittle. I heard a sound like fine china shattering. A pained, inhuman shriek echoed around me, and the grip was gone. I threw the door open, stumbled inside, and slammed it shut, twisting the deadbolt just as a dozen tiny fists began to hammer against the steel. I collapsed against the door, my body trembling, gasping for air. The hammering was joined by a scratching sound, like tiny fingernails or porcelain fingers scraping down the metal. Then came the voices, whispering from the other side of the door. My name, over and over. "Alex! Alex, let us in. We want to see you too." The PA system crackled to life again, but this time it wasn't a giggle. It was a symphony of them, a chorus of distorted, childlike laughter that filled the tiny office, seeming to come from the very walls. I curled into a ball in the corner, covered my ears, and waited for the dawn. The noises stopped the second the first hint of morning light filtered through the factory's grimy skylights. Silence returned, absolute and total. After an hour of shaking in the corner, I found the courage to open the door. Everything was normal. Every doll, including sweet Annabelle with a brand new, spiderweb crack across her face, was back in its glass case. Their smiles were placid, their eyes were vacant. The only evidence of the night's horror was the deep, thin scratches gouged into the outside of the security door, and a single tiny porcelain finger lying on the floor mat. I didn't even clock out. I walked out of the Auerbach & Sons toy factory, got in my car, and never went back. It's been 5 years. I have a different job, a different life, but I'm not free. Sometimes I see them in crowds, a child with eyes that are a little too glassy, a smile that's a little too fixed. I wake up, some nights to the faint sound of tapping on my bedroom window. Last week, a package arrived at my apartment. No return address. My hands trembled as I opened it. Inside, nestled in a bed of tissue paper, was a single porcelain doll, blonde hair, a pale blue dress, and piercing, crystalline blue eyes. Tucked under its arm was a small, handwritten note. It said, "Now we can see you too."